讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅第27節，呢節嘅名叫做 Wherein it is shown who Master Pedro and his ape were, together with this mishap Don Quixote and in the braying adventure, which he did not conclude as he would have liked or as he had expected。 上一次就講到喺個旅館入面 Don Quixote 再一次佢個遊俠精神呢就掩蓋佢理智，摧毀咗成個木偶戲。Master Pedro 咧當然就要求賠償，而 Sancho 咧亦都願意賠償，同 Don Quixote 一齊拎錢出嚟。除咗 Pedro 之外，仲要賠俾旅館嘅老闆啦，同埋所有現場嘅觀眾。大家收到錢啦，都叫做安然離開。第二日咧 Sancho 同Don Quixote 亦都離開呢個旅館。咁睇題目似乎呢個女仔大叫仲未結束喎，我哋睇下 Braying Adventure 會有啲咩發展先。
Cide Hamete, the chronicler of this great history, begins this chapter with these words: I swear as a Catholic Christian, with regard to which his translator says that Cide Hamete is swearing as a Catholic Christian, he being, as no doubt he was, a Moor, only meant that just as a Catholic Christian taking an oath swears or ought to swear what is true and tell the truth in what he avers, so he was telling the truth, as much as if he swore as a Catholic Christian in all he chose to write about Quixote, especially in declaring who Master Pedro was and what was the defining ape that astonished all the villagers with his divinations. He says then that he who has read the first part of this history will remember well enough the Gines de Pasamonte whom, with only galley slaves, Don Quixote set free in the Sierra Morena, a kindness for which he afterwards got poor thanks and worse payment from that evil-minded, ill-conditioned set. These Gines de Pasamonte, Don Ginesios de Parapilla, Don Quixote called him. It was that stole Dapple from Sancho Panza, which, because by the fault of the printers neither the how nor the when was stated in the first part, has been a puzzle to a good many people, who attribute to the bad memory of the author what was the error of the press. In fact, however, Gines stole him while Sancho Panza was asleep on his back, adopting the plan and device that Brunello had recourse to when he stole Sacripante's horse from between his legs at the siege of Albraca, and, as has been told, Sancho afterwards recovered him. This Gines, then, afraid of being caught by the officers of justice, who were looking for him to punish him for his numberless rascalities and offences, resolved to shift his quarters into the kingdom of Aragon, and cover up his left eye, and take up the trade of a puppet showman. For this, as well as juggling, he knew how to practice to perfection. From some released Christians returning from Barbary, it so happened, he bought the ape, which he taught to mount upon his shoulder on his making a certain sign, and to whisper, or seem to do so, in his ear. Thus prepared, before entering any village whither he was bound with his show and his ape, he used to inform himself at the nearest village, or from the most likely person he could find, as to what particular things had happened there, and to whom, and bearing them well in mind, the first thing he did was to exhibit his show, sometimes one story, sometimes another, but all lively, amusing, and familiar. As soon as the exhibition was over, he brought forward the accomplishments of his ape, assuring the public that he defined all the past and the present, but as to the future he had no skill. For each question answered, he asked 2 reels, and for some he made a reduction, just as he happened to feel the pulse of the questioners. And when now and then he came to houses where things that he knew of had happened to the people living there, even if they did not ask him a question, not caring to pay for it, he would make the sign to the ape and then declare that it had said so and so, which fitted the case exactly. In this way he acquired a prodigious name, and all ran after him. On other occasions, being very crafty, he would answer in such a way that the answers suited the questions, and as no one cross-questioned him or pressed him to tell how his ape defined, he made fools of them all and filled his pouch. The instant he entered the inn, he knew Don Quixote and Sancho, and with that knowledge it was easy for him to astonish them and all who were there. But it would have cost him dear had Don Quixote brought down his hand a little lower when he cut off King Marsilio's head and destroyed all his horsemen, as related in the preceding chapter. So much for Master Pedro and his ape. And now to return to Don Quixote of La Mancha. After he had left the inn, he determined to visit, first of all, the banks of the Ebro in that neighborhood, before entering the city of Zaragoza, for the ample time there was still to spare before the jousts left him enough for all. With this object in view, he followed the road and traveled along it for 2 days, without meeting any adventure worth committing to writing until on the third day. As he was ascending a hill, he heard a great noise of drums, trumpets, and musket shots. At first he imagined some regiment of soldiers was passing that way, and to see them he spurred Rocinante and mounted the hill. On reaching the top, he saw at the foot of it over 200 men, as it seemed to him, armed with weapons of various sorts, lances, crossbows, partisans, halberds, and pikes, and a few muskets and a great many bucklers. He descended the slope and approached the band near enough to see distinctly the flags, make out the colors, and distinguish the devices they bore, especially one on the standard or ensign of white satin, on which there was painted in a very lifelike style an ass like a little sard, with its head up, its mouth open, and its tongue out, as if it were in the act and attitude of braying, and round it were inscribed in large characters these 2 lines: "They did not bray in vain, our alcaldes twain." From this device, Don Quixote concluded that these people must be from the braying town, and he said so to Sancho, explaining to him what was written on the standard. At the same time, be observed that the man who had told them about the matter was wrong in saying that the 2 who brayed were regidors, for according to the lines of the standard, they were alcaldes. To which Sancho replied, "Señor, there's nothing to stick at in that, for maybe the regidors who brayed then came to be alcaldes of their town afterwards, and so they may go by both titles. Moreover, it has nothing to do with the truth of the story whether the brayers were alcaldes or regidors, provided at any rate they did bray, for an alcalde is just as likely to bray as a regidor." They perceived, in short, clearly that the town which had been twitted had turned out to do battle with some other that had jeered it more than was fair or neighborly. Don Quixote proceeded to join them, not a little to Sancho's uneasiness, for he never relished mixing himself up in expeditions of that sort. The members of the troop received him into the midst of them, taking him to be someone who was on their side. Don Quixote, putting up his visor, advanced with an easy bearing and demeanor to the standard with the ass, and all the chief men of the army gathered round him to look at him, staring at him with the usual amazement that everybody felt on seeing him for the first time. Don Quixote, seeing them examining him so attentively, and that none of them spoke to him or put any question to him, determined to take advantage of their silence. So, breaking his own, he lifted up his voice and said, "Worthy sirs, I entreat you as earnestly as I cannot to interrupt an argument I wish to address to you, until you find it displeases or wearies you. And if that come to pass, on the slightest hint you give me, I will put a seal upon my lips and a gag upon my tongue." They all bade him say what he liked, for they would listen to him willingly. With this permission, Don Quixote went on to say, "I, sirs, am a knight errant whose calling is that of arms, and whose profession is to protect those who require protection, and give help to such as stand in need of it. Some days ago I became acquainted with your misfortune and the cause which impels you to take up arms again and again to revenge yourselves upon your enemies. And having many times thought over your business in my mind, I find that, according to the laws of combat, you are mistaken in holding yourselves insulted. For a private individual cannot insult an entire community, unless it be by devying it collectively as a traitor, because he cannot tell who in particular is guilty of the treason for which he devies it. Of this we have an example in Don Diego Ordonez de Lara, who defied the whole town of Zamora, because he did not know that Valladolfos alone had committed the treachery of slaying his king, and therefore he defied them all, and vengeance and reply concerned all. Though, to be sure, Signor Don Diego went rather too far, indeed very much beyond the limits of a defiance, for he had no occasion to defy the dead, or the waters, or the fishes, or those yet unborn, and all the rest of it as set forth. But let that pass. For when anger breaks out, there's no father, governor, or bridle to check the tongue. The case being then, that no one person can insult a kingdom, province, city, state, or entire community. It is clear there is no reason for going out to avenge the defiance of such an insult, inasmuch as it is not one. A fine thing it would be if the people of the clock town were to be at loggerheads every moment with everyone who called them by that name. all the cazoleros, buranganeros, bolonatos, chaboneros, or the bearers of all the other names and titles that are always in the mouth of the boys and common people. It would be a nice business indeed if all these illustrious cities were to take huff and revenge themselves and go about perpetually making trombones of their swords in every petty quarrel. No, God forbid. There are 4 things for which sensible men and well-ordered states ought to take up arms, draw their swords, and risk their persons, lives, and properties. The first is to defend the Catholic faith. The second, to defend one's life, which is in accordance with natural and divine law. The third, in defense of one's honor, family, and property. The fourth, in the service of one's king in a just war. And if to these we choose to add a fifth, in defense of one's country. To these 5, as it were capital courses, there may be added some others that may be just and reasonable, and make it a duty to take up arms. But to take them up for trifles and things to laugh at and be amused by rather than offended, looks as though he who did so was altogether wanting in common sense. Moreover, in take an unjust revenge is directly opposed to the sacred law that we acknowledge, wherein we are commanded to do good to our enemies and to love them that hate us. A command which, though it seems somewhat difficult to obey, is only so to those who have in them less of God than of the world, and more of the flesh than of the spirit. For Jesus Christ, God and true man, who never lied, and could not and cannot lie, said, as our lawgiver, that his yoke was easy and his burden light. He would not, therefore, have laid any command upon us that it was impossible to obey. Thus, sirs, you are bound to keep quiet by human and divine law. The devil take me, said Sancho to himself at this, but this master of mine is a theologian, or, if not faith, he is as one egg is like another. Don Quixote stopped to take breath, and, observing that silence was still preserved, had a mind to continue his discourse, and would have done so had not Sancho interposed with his smartness. For he, seeing his master pause, took the lead, saying, My Lord Don Quixote of La Mancha, who once was called the Knight of the Rueful Countenance, but now is called the Knight of the Lions, is a gentleman of great discretion, who knows Latin and his mother tongue like a bachelor, and in everything that he deals with or advises proceeds like a good soldier, and has all the laws and ordinances of what they call combat at his fingers' ends. So you have nothing to do but to let yourselves be guided by what he says, and on my head be it if it is wrong. Besides which, you have been told that it is folly to take offense at merely hearing a bray. I remember when I was a boy, I brayed as often as I had a fancy, without anyone hindering me, and so elegantly and naturally that when I brayed, all the asses in the town would bray. But I was none the less for that the son of my parents, who were greatly respected, and though I was envied because of the gift by more than one of the high and mighty ones of the town, I did not care 2 farthings for it. And that you may see I am telling the truth. Wait a bit and listen, for this art, like swimming, once learned is never forgotten. And then, taking hold of his nose, he began to bray so vigorously that all the valleys around rang again. One of those, however, that stood near him, fancying he was mocking them, lifted up a long staff he had in his hand, and smote him such a blow with it that Sancho dropped helpless to the ground. Don Quixote, seeing him so roughly handled, attacked the man who had struck him lance in hand, but so many thrust themselves between them that he could not avenge him. Far from it, finding a shower of stones rained upon him, and crossbows and muskets unnumbered levelled at him, he wheeled Rocinante round and, as fast as his best gallop could take him, fled from the midst of them, commending himself to God with all his heart to deliver him out of this peril, in dread every step of some ball coming in at his back and coming out at his breast, and every minute drawing his breath to see whether it had gone from him. The members of the band, however, were satisfied with seeing him take to flight, and did not fire on him. They put up Sancho, scarcely restored to his senses, on his ass, and let him go after his master. Not that he was sufficiently in his wits to guide the beast, but Dapple followed the footsteps of Rocinante, from whom he could not remain a moment separated. Don Quixote, having got some way off, looked back, and seeing Sancho coming, waited for him, as he perceived that no one followed him. The men of the troop stood their ground till night, and as the enemy did not come up to battle, they returned to their town exulting. And had they been aware of the ancient custom of the Greeks, they would have erected a trophy on the spot.
我呢一節讀到嚟呢一度，呢一節咧就分2個部分。第一個部分咧就係作者 唔係書入面嘅作者，係作者話寫呢個 Don Quixote 歷史嘅另一位作者啊，叫做 Cide Hamete。咁佢咧就話 Master Pedro 原來嘅真正身份咧就係 Gines de Pasamonte。呢個 Gines de Pasamonte 係邊個咧？就係之前 Don Quixote 解放咗一啲船上面嘅奴隸 ，Pasamonte 係其中之一個。呢個 Pasamonte 其後咧有偷過 Central 嘅女仔嘅，同主僕兩人咧一路都有啲交割過節，一路過重實物，亦都知道佢哋一啲事蹟咁啦，所以形成咧 Gines Pasamonte 其後啊，藉住星星佢嘅假預言，就講得出 Central 嘅一啲事 ，Don Quixote 嘅一啲事，因為佢根本就係識得佢哋嘅。Pasamonte 嘅行騙手法咧好簡單啫，就係入村之前就同村民就問下套下料啊，問下佢哋村入面嘅情況咧，然之後咧佢就揾到隻猩猩，就好似表現出嚟咧係會同佢耳語嘅，亦都限制住只係會知道而家或者過去發生過嘅事，就係佢喺村民口中得知嘅事，就唔識得將來嘅事嘅。然之後就製造出一個假象咧，就係佢好清楚某啲事。或者佢只係會講一啲佢清楚嘅嘢，佢揀一啲佢清楚嘅嘢嚟講，而製造呢個假象，就係咁嘅，有一個行騙手法。第二個部分咧就係 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 繼續上路啦，行咗3日，終於遇到為咗驢仔聲兩個村落去打起上嚟、大戰起上嚟嘅呢個戰場，咁啊去到其中之一方，然之後咧 Don Quixote 咧走入去呢個人群軍隊入面咧，就同佢哋咧發出佢嘅豪言壯語，佢就話咧：你因為驢仔而打仗咧，呢個係何其可笑！一個騎士要為咗戰鬥咧，只係有幾個原因嘅啫，就係保衛基督教啦，保衛佢自己嘅生命、佢嘅家庭、佢嘅財產，又或者係遵從皇上嘅意志。如果唔係呢幾樣嘢咧，係絕對冇意思去打嘅。佢呢個豪言壯語令到現場嘅人都靜默起上嚟，都喺度思考緊。而喺呢個時候咧 Sancho 就加把嘴啦，佢話我同意個主人所講嘅嘢啊。其實我以前咧都扮嚟仔扮得好似噶，但係咁啊點啫？冇影響到我噶，冇影響到我攻擊其他人噶。嗱，我嗌一次俾你聽啊。然之後佢就嗌，但一嗌咧就令到軍隊入面嘅人咧以為佢喺度揶揄緊佢哋，於是乎咧就嬲起上嚟咧。就動手啦！眾人咧就對 Sancho 對 Don Quixote 就不停喺度掟石啊，甚至乎攻擊佢哋啊。咁呢兩人咧就落荒而逃。好彩咧佢哋走得甩，如果唔係咧，應該就凶多吉少噶啦。好，我哋睇下呢字有啲咩字同大家分享啊。有一個字同大家分享啦 ，loggerhead，log 即係一嚿木啦。呢個字有幾個解釋嘅，咁其他啲我唔講啦，主要係文中嘅解釋。loggerhead 就真係一個傻人 ，foolish person， 有個頭好似木棗咁樣啊 ，loggerhead。呢次翻嚟呢度啦，下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日我哋繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 我哋讀到 Part 2嘅第28節。呢節嘅名叫做 Of matters that Benegatti says he who reads them will know, if he reads them with attention。 上一回咧就講到有關 Don Quixote 嘅歷史故事啊嘅呢個虛構嘅作者咧，就解釋先前帶住星星嘅主人啊呢個 Master Pedro 咧，佢其實就係 Gines de Pasamonte， 就係好耐之前 Don Quixote 所救出嚟嘅一個罪犯，一個囚犯。咁呢個 Pasamonte 一直以嚟就潛藏喺一個地方，改頭換姓，揾到個猩猩，訓練咗佢，利用呢個猩猩咧去呃神騙鬼嘅。Anyway，Don Quixote 同 Sancho 都離開咗呢一個村啦。咁佢哋上路咗幾日之後咧，就遇到先前有關於驢叫而搞到要大打出手呢兩個村落嘅一啲軍旅。Don Quixote 咧就叫停咗其中之一方，然之後同佢哋講，就話作為一個武者啊，係唔應該隨便出手嘅。你要出手咧，只係4個原因：一係你就守護天主教，一係咧你就守護你自己嘅生命，或者保衛家園，或者咧你係遵從你個皇上嘅旨意。如果唔係咧，作為一個好嘅基督徒咧，係唔應該出手嘅。咁大家正當覺得係佢好似講得有啲道理嘅時候咧，呢個 Sancho 咧就決定幫手，就話其實我都嗌得好似驢叫噶，不過後來我冇繼續去驢叫咁解啫嘛。嗱，我嗌俾你聽啦。咁 咁佢嗌出嚟咧，啲人咧就以為佢咧就喺度嘲諷緊，於是乎咧就立即咧就出手，就打阿 Sancho 同埋阿 Don Quixote，定到佢哋落荒而逃啦。兩人逃走咗之後咧，呢啲村民咧亦都喺度等對家出現啦，準備大戰啦。但係既然對方冇出現啦，咁佢哋咧都翻咗屋企啦。好，呢個故事咧繼續落去啦，睇下逃走咗嘅 Don Quixote之後又出咗啲咩事啊
？When the brave man flees, treachery is manifest, and it is for wise men to reserve themselves for better occasions. This proved to be the case with Don Quixote, who, giving way before the fury of the townsfolk and the hostile intentions of the angry troop, took to flight and, without a thought of Sancho or the danger in which he was leaving him, retreated to such a distance as he thought made him safe. Sancho, lying across his ass, followed him, as has been said, and at length came up, having by this time recovered his senses, and on joining him, let himself drop off Dapple at Rocinante's feet, sore, bruised, and belaboured. Don Quixote dismounted to examine his wounds, but finding him whole from head to foot, he said to him, angrily enough, In an evil hour did thou take to braying, Sancho. Where hast thou learned that it is well done to mention the rope in the house of the man that has been hanged? To the music of brays, what harmonies could thou expect to get but cudgels? Give thanks to God, Sancho, that they signed the cross on thee just now with a stick, and did not mark thee by the sign of the cross with a cutlass. I'm not equal to answering, said Sancho, for I feel as if I was speaking through my shoulders. Let us mount and get away from this. I'll keep from braying, but not from saying that knights errant fly and leave their good squires to be pounded like privet, or make meal of at the hands of their enemies. He does not fly who retires, returned Don Quixote, for I would have thee know, Sancho, that the valour which is not based upon a foundation of prudence is called rashness, and exploits of the rash men are to be attributed rather to good fortune than to courage. And so I own that I retired, but not that I fled. And therein I have followed the example of many valiant men who have reserved themselves for better times. The histories are full of instances of this, but as it would not be any good to thee or pleasure to me, I will not recount them to thee now. Sancho was by this time mounted with the help of Don Quixote, who then himself mounted Rocinante, and at a leisurely pace they proceeded to take shelter in a grove which was in sight about a quarter of a league off. Every now and then Sancho gave vent to deep sighs and dismal groans, and on Don Quixote asking him what caused such acute suffering, he replied that from the end of his backbone up to the nape of his neck, he was so sore that it nearly drove him out of his senses. The cause of that soreness, said Don Quixote, will be, no doubt, that the staff wherein they smote thee being a very long one, it caught thee all down the back, where all the parts that are sore are situated, and had it reached any further, thou wouldst be sorer still. By God, said Sancho, your worship has relieved me of a great doubt, and cleared up the point for me in elegant style. Body o' me, is the cause of my soreness such a mystery that there isn't any need to tell me I'm sore everywhere the staff hit me? If it was my ankles that pained me there, it might be something in going to finding why they did, but it is not much to define that I'm sore where they thrash me. By my faith, mastermind, the ills of others hang by a hair. Every day I'm discovering more and more how little I have to hope for from keeping company with your worship. For if this time you have allowed me to be drubbed, the next time, or 100 times more, we'll have the blanketings of the other day over again, and all the other pranks which, if they have fallen on my shoulders now, will be thrown in my teeth by and by. I would do a great deal better, I say, to go home to my wife and children and support them and bring them up on what God may please to give me, instead of following your worship along roads that lead nowhere and paths that are none at all, with little to drink and less to eat. And then when it comes to sleeping, measure out 7 feet on the earth, brother squire, and if that's not enough for you, take as many more, for you may have it all your own way and stretch yourself to your heart's content. Oh, that I could see burnt and turned to ashes the first man that meddled with knight-errantry, or at any rate the first who chose to be squire to such fools as all the knights-errant of past times must have been. Of those of the present day I say nothing, because, as your worship is one of them, I respect them, and because I know your worship knows a point more than the devil in all you say and think. I would lay a good wager with you, Sancho, said Don Quixote, that now that you are talking and without anyone to stop you, you don't feel a pain in your whole body. Talk away, my son. Say whatever comes into your head or mouth, for so long as you feel no pain, the irritation your impertinences give me will be a pleasure to me. And if you are so anxious to go home to your wife and children, God forbid that I should prevent you. You have money of mine. See how long it is since we left our village this third time, and how much you can and ought to earn every month, and pay yourself out of your own hand. When I worked for Tom Carrasco, the father of the bachelor Samson Carrasco that your worship knows, replied Sancho, I used to earn 2 ducats a month besides my food. I can't tell what I can earn with your worship, though I know a knight-errant squire has harder times of it than he who works for a farmer. For after all, we who work for farmers, however much we toil all day, at the worst, at night, we have our honest supper and sleep in the bed, which I have not slept in since I have been in your worship's service. If it wasn't a short time we were in Don Diego de Miranda's house, at the feast I had with the skimmings I took off Camacho's pots, and what I ate, drank, and slept in Basilio's house, all the rest of the time I have been sleeping on the hard ground under the open sky, exposed to what they call the inclemencies of heaven, keeping alive in me with scraps of cheese and crusts of bread, and drinking water either from the brooks or from the springs we come to on these bypaths we travel. I own, Sancho, said Don Quixote, that all thou sayest is true. How much, thinkest thou, ought I to give thee over and above what Tom Carrasco gave thee? I think, said Sancho, that if your worship was to add on 2 reals a month, I'd consider myself well paid. That is, as far as the wages of my labor go. But to make up for me for your worship's pledge and promise to me to give me the government of an island, it would be fair to add 6 reals more, making 30 in all. Very good, said Don Quixote. It is 25 days since we left our village, so reckon up, Sancho, according to the wages you have made out for yourself, and see how much I owe you in proportion, and pay yourself, as I said before, out of your own hand. Oh, body o' me, said Sancho, but your worship is very much out in that reckoning, for when it comes to the promise of the island, we must count from the day your worship promised it to me to this present hour we are at now. Well, how long is it, Sancho, since I promised it to you? Said Don Quixote. If I remember rightly, said Sancho, it must be over 20 years, 3 days more or less. Don Quixote gave himself a great slap on the forehead and began to laugh heartily, and said he, Why, I have not been wandering, either in the Sierra Morena or in the whole course of our studies, but barely 2 months, and thou sayest, Sancho, that it is 20 years since I promised thee the island. I believe now thou wouldst have all the money thou hast of mine go in thy wages. If so, and if that be thy pleasure, I give it to thee now, once and for all, and much good may it do thee. For so long as I see myself rid of such a good-for-nothing squire, I'd be glad to be left a pauper without a rap. But tell me, thou perverter of the squirely rules of knight-errantry, where hast thou ever seen or read that any knight-errant squire make terms with his lord? You must give me so much a month for serving you. Plunge, scoundrel, rogue, monster. For such I take thee to be. Plunge, I say, into the great sea of their histories. And if thou shalt find that any squire ever said or thought what thou hast said now, I will let thee nail it on my forehead and give me over and about 4 sound slaps in the face. Turn the rein, or the halter, off thy dapple, and be gone home. For 1 single step further thou shalt not make in my company. O bread thanklessly received, O promises ill bestowed, O man more beast than human being. Now, when I was about to raise thee to such position, that in spite of thy wife, they would call thee my lord, thou art leaving me? Thou art going now when I had a firm and fixed intention of making thee lord of the best island in the world? Well, as thou thyself hast said before now, honey is not from the mouth of the ass. As thou art, as thou wilt be, and as thou wilt end when the course of thy life is run. For I know it will come to its close before thou dost perceive or discern that thou art a beast. Sancho regarded Don Quixote earnestly while he was giving him this rating, and was so touched by remorse that the tears came to his eyes, and in a piteous and broken voice he said to him, Master mine, I confess that to be a complete ass, all I want is a tail. If your worship will only fix one onto me, I'll look on it as rightly placed, and I'll serve you as an ass all the remaining days of my life. Forgive me and have pity on my folly. And remember, I know but little, and if I talk much, it's more from infirmity than malice. But he who sins and commends himself to God. I should have been surprised, Sancho, said Don Quixote, if thou hadst not introduced some bit of a proverb into thy speech. Well, I forgive thee, provided thou dost mend and not show thyself in future so fond of thine own interest, but try to be of good cheer and take heart, and encourage thyself to look forward to the fulfillment of my promises, which, by being delayed, does not become impossible. Sancho said he would do so, and keep up his heart as best he could. They then entered the grove, and Don Quixote settled himself at the foot of an elm, and Sancho at that of a beech, for trees of this kind and others like them always have feet but no hands. Sancho passed the night in pain, for with the evening dews the blow of the staff made itself felt all the more. Don Quixote passed it in his never-failing meditations, but for all that they had some winks of sleep, and with the appearance of daylight they pursued their journey in quest of the banks of the famous Eyre, where that befell them which will be told in the following chapter.
好，呢一節好簡短，主要就係講 Sancho 佢嘅不滿啊，對於 Don Quixote 嘅不滿。首先呢，就係當佢哋兩個俾村民打嘅時候 ，Don Quixote 冇挺身而出保護佢啦。Don Quixote 嘅回應呢，就係你自己嘅愚勇，你冇審度好時勢，呢個係你嘅愚蠢。Sancho 咧就話佢餐風飲露，非常之辛苦，冇好啖飯食。佢話不如咧，我哋而家計數啦，我哋分翻去家當，我翻鄉下啦。Don Quixote 咧亦都不甘示弱，形容佢係一隻畜生咁去數落佢，又唔忠心啦，又愚蠢啦咁樣。數到最後咧 ，Sancho 就懺悔啦，覺得自己咧唔啱，請求 Don Quixote 繼續收佢咧作為侍從，佢有身伴意足啊。Don Quixote 就話可以嘅，我接受。總之你又注意自己嘅言行啦、態度啦，唔好淨係諗自己啦，對所有嘢咧都和順啲咁就得噶啦。咁於是乎兩人咧就繼續上路，就喺一啲白楊樹下咧休息。呢一次我哋冇咩生字，我哋下一次再同大家讀你聽，拜拜。大家好，讀你聽2.0，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅 Chapter 29。呢一節嘅名叫做 Of the Famous Adventure of the Enchanted Bark。上一回咧講到侍從兩人Don Quixote 同 Sancho 之間嘅一個爭執，最後咧就係以 Sancho 衷心道歉，乞求 Don Quixote 繼續收佢做侍從為結束嘅。Don Quixote 咧亦都叫做動過下火，即係又斥責嗰個 Sancho 啦，話佢唔忠心啊，諸如此類。無論如何都好啦，兩人已經修好，都繼續上路。咁我哋睇下兩人繼續上路之後咧，有啲咩新嘢嚟揭啊
？By stages as already described or left undescribed, 2 days after quitting the grove, Don Quixote and Sancho reached the river Eyre, and the sight of it was a great delight to Don Quixote as he contemplated and gazed upon the charms of its banks, the clearness of its stream, the gentleness of its current and the abundance of its crystal waters, and the pleasant view revived 1,000 tender thoughts in his mind. Above all, he dwelt upon what he had seen in the cave of Montesinos, for though Master Pedro's ape had told him that of those things part was true, part false, he clung more to their truth than to their falsehood, the very reverse of Sancho, who held them all to be downright lies. As they were thus proceeding then, they discovered a small boat, without oars or any other gear, that lay at the water's edge tied to the stem of a tree growing on the bank. Don Quixote looked all round, and seeing nobody at once, without more ado, dismounted from Rocinante and bade Sancho get down from Dapple and tie both beasts securely to the trunk of a poplar or willow that stood there. Sancho asked him the reason of this sudden dismounting and tying. Don Quixote made answer, "Thou must know, Sancho, that this bark is plainly, without the possibility of any alternative, calling and inviting me to enter it, and in it go to give aid to some knight or other person of distinction in need of it, who is no doubt in some sore strait. for this is the way of the books of chivalry and of the enchanters who figure in speaking them. When a knight is involved in some difficulty from which he cannot be delivered save by the hand of another knight, though they may be at a distance of 2,000 or 3,000 leagues or more one from the other, they either take him up on a cloud, or they provide a bark for him to get into, and in less than the twinkling of an eye they carry him where he will and where his help is required. And so, Sancho, this bark is placed here for the same purpose. This is as true as that it is now day. And ere this one passes tie Dapple and Rocinante together, and then in God's hand be it to guide us. For I would not hold back from embarking, though barefooted friars were to beg me. As that's the case, said Sancho, and your worship chooses to give in to these, I don't know if I may call them absurdities. At every turn, there's nothing for it but to obey and bow the head, bearing in mind the proverb, do as thy master bids thee, and sit down to table with him. But for all that, for the sake of easing my conscience, I warn your worship that it is my opinion this bark is no enchanted one, but belongs to some of the fishermen of the river, for they catch the best shad in the well here. As Sancho said this, he tied the beasts, leaving them to the care and protection of the enchanters with sorrow enough in his heart. Don Quixote bade him not be uneasy about deserting the animals, for he who would carry themselves over such longínquous roads and regions would take care to feed them. I don't understand that longínquous, said Sancho, for have I ever heard the word all the days of my life? Longínquous, replied Don Quixote, means far off. But it is no wonder thou dost not understand it, for thou art not bound to know Latin, like some who pretend to know it and don't. Now they are tied, said Sancho. What are we to do next? What? Said Don Quixote. Cross ourselves and weigh anchor. I mean, embark and cut the moorings by which the bark is held, and the bark began to drift away slowly from the bank. But when Sancho saw himself somewhere about 2 yards out in the river, he began to tremble and give himself up for lost. But nothing distressed him more than hearing Dapple bray and seeing Rocinante struggling to get loose. And said he to his master, Dapple is braying in grief at our leaving him, and Rocinante is trying to escape and plunge in after us. Oh, dear friends, peace be with you, and may this madness that is taking us away from you turn into sober sense, bring us back to you. And with this he fell weeping so bitterly that Don Quixote said to him sharply and angrily, What art thou afraid of, cowardly creature? What art thou weeping at, heart of butterpaste? Who pursues or molests thee, thou soul of a tame mouse? What dost thou want, unsatisfied in the very heart of abundance? Art thou, perchance, tramping barefoot over the Riphean mountains, instead of being seated on a bench like an archduke on the tranquil stream of this pleasant river, from which in a short space we shall come up upon the broad sea? But we must have already emerged and gone 700 or 800 leagues, and if I had here an astrolabe to take the altitude of the pole, I could tell thee how many we have travelled, though either I know little, or we have already crossed, or shall shortly cross the equinoctial line which parts the two opposite poles midway. And when we come to that line your worship speaks of, said Sancho, how far shall we have gone? Very far, said Don Quixote, for of the 360 degrees that this terraqueous globe contains, as computed by Ptolemy, the greatest cosmographer known, we shall have travelled 1/2 when we come to the line I spoke of. By God, said Sancho, your worship gives me a nice authority for what you say. Putrid dolly something transmogrified, or whatever it is. Don Quixote laughed at the interpretation Sancho put upon computed, in the name of the cosmographer Ptolemy, and said he, Thou must know, Sancho, that with the Spaniards and those who embark at Cadiz for the East Indies, one of the signs they have to show them when they have passed the equinoctial line I told thee of, is that the lights die upon everybody on board the ship, and not a single one is left, or to be found in the whole vessel if they gave us weight in gold for it. So, Sancho, thou mayest as well pass thy hand down thy thigh, and if thou comest upon anything live, we shall be no longer in doubt. If not, then we have crossed. I don't believe a bit of it, said Sancho. Still, I'll do as your worship bids me, though I don't know what need there is for trying these experiments. For I can see with my own eyes that we have not moved 5 yards away from the bank, or shifted 2 yards from where the animals stand. For there are Rocinante and Dapple in the very same place where we left them, and watching a point, as I do now, I swear by all that's good, we are not stirring or moving at the pace of an ant. Try the test I told thee of, Sancho, said Don Quixote, and don't mind any other, for thou knowest nothing about colours, lines, parallels, zodiacs, ecliptics, poles, solstice, equinoxes, planets, signs, bearings, and the measures of which the celestial and terrestrial spheres are composed. If thou wert acquainted with all these things, or any portion of them, thou wouldst see clearly how many parallels we have cut, what signs we have seen, and what constellations we have left behind and are now leaving behind. But again I tell thee, feel and hunt, for I am certain thou art cleaner than a sheet of smooth white paper. Sancho felt, and passing his hand gently and carefully down to the hollow of his left knee, he looked up at his master and said, Either the test is a false one, or we have not come to where your worship says, nor within many leagues of it. Why, how so? Asked Don Quixote. Hast thou come upon aught? Aye, and aughts, replied Sancho, and shaking his fingers he washed his whole hand in the river along which the boat was quietly gliding in midstream, not moved by any occult intelligence or invisible enchanter, but simply by the current, just there smooth and gentle. They now came in sight of some large water mills that stood in the middle of the river, and the instant Don Quixote saw them cried out, Seest thou there, my friend? There stands the castle or fortress, where there is, no doubt, some knight in durance, or ill-used queen or infanta or princess, in whose aid I am brought hither. What the devil city, fortress, or castle is your worship talking about, senor? Said Sancho. Don't you see that those are mills that stand in the river to grind corn? Hold thy peace, Sancho, said Don Quixote. Though they look like mills, they are not so. I have already told thee that enchantments transform things and change their proper shapes. I do not mean to say they really change them from one form into another, but that it seems as though they did, as experience proved in the transformation of Dulcinea, sole refuge of my hopes. By this time, the boat, having reached the middle of the stream, began to move less slowly than hitherto. The millers belonging to the mills, when they saw the boat coming down the river and on the point of being sucked in by the draught of the wheels, ran out in haste, several of them, with long poles to stop it, and being all mealy, with faces and garments covered with flour, they presented a sinister appearance. They raised loud shouts, crying, Devils of men, where are you going to? Are you mad? Do you want to drown yourselves or dash yourselves to pieces among these wheels? Did I not tell thee, Sancho, said Don Quixote at this, that we had reached the place where I am to show what the might of my arm can do? See what ruffians and villains come out against me. See what monsters oppose me. See what hideous countenance come to frighten us. You shall soon see, scoundrels. And then stand up in the boat, he began in a loud voice to hurl threats at the millers, exclaiming, Ill-conditioned and worse-counselled rabble, restore to liberty and freedom the person ye hold in durance in this your fortress or prison, high or low, or of whatever rank or quality he be, for I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, otherwise called the Knight of the Lions, for whom, by the disposition of heaven above, it is reserved to give a happy issue to this adventure. And so saying, he drew his sword and began making passes in the air at the millers, who, hearing but not understanding all this nonsense, strove to stop the boat, which was now getting into the rushing channel of the wheels. Sancho fell upon his knees, devoutly appealing to heaven to deliver him from such imminent peril, which it did by the activity and quickness of the millers, who, pushing against the boat with their poles, stopped it, not, however, without upsetting or throwing Don Quixote and Sancho into the water. And lucky it was for Don Quixote that he could swim like a goose, though the weight of his armor carried him twice to the bottom, and had it not been for the millers who plunged in and hoisted them both out, it would have been Troy down with the pair of them. As soon as, more drenched than thirsty, and they were landed, Sancho went down on his knees, and with clasped hands and eyes raised to heaven, prayed a long and fervent prayer to God to deliver him evermore from the rash projects and attempts of his master. The fishermen, the owners of the boat, which the mill wheels had knocked to pieces, now came up, and seeing it smashed, they proceeded to strip Sancho and to demand payment for it from Don Quixote. But he, with great calmness, just as if nothing had happened, told the millers and fishermen that he would pay for the bark most cheerfully, on condition that they delivered up to him, free and unhurt, the person or persons that were in durance in that castle of theirs. What persons or what castle art thou talking of, madman? Art thou for carrying off the people who come to grind corn in these mills? That's enough, said Don Quixote to himself. It would be preaching in the desert to attempt by entreaties to induce this rabble to do any virtuous action. In this adventure, two mighty enchanters must have encountered one another, and one frustrates what the other attempts. One provided the bark for me, and the other upset me. God help us. This world is all machinations and schemes at cross purposes, one with the other. I can do no more. And then turning towards the mills, he said aloud, Friends, whoever you be that are immured in that prison, forgive me that, to my misfortune and yours, I cannot deliver you from your misery. This adventure is doubtless reserved and destined for some other night. So saying, he settled with the fishermen, and paid 50 reals for the boat, which Sancho handed to them very much against the grain, saying, With a couple more bark businesses like this, we shall have sunk our whole capital. The fishermen and the millers stood staring in amazement at the two figures, so very different to all appearance from ordinary men, and were wholly unable to make out the drift of the observations and questions Don Quixote addressed to them, and coming to the conclusion that they were madmen, they left them and betook themselves, the millers to their mills and the fishermen to their huts. Don Quixote and Sancho returned to their beasts, and to their life of beasts, and so ended the adventure of the enchanted bark.
好，呢一節讀完啦。呢節咧就講侍從兩人嚟到河邊，叫做 Eyre。河邊佢哋見到隻船冇船長嘅，只係隻空船。Don Quixote 又再次騎士精神上身啦，咁就認為咧係有人需要得到拯救，出咗事，就要求 Sancho 就將兩個坐騎綁起，然之後咧佢哋兩個咧就要落水，要上船，就要揾失蹤人士，睇下邊個需要拯救。船上邊 Don Quixote 就話一定係咧有無施嘅法咧，令到佢哋咧呢個日行千里啊，佢哋已經過咗赤道啦咁樣。但係 Sancho 就話啦，我哋綁咗喺岸邊嗰度隻畜生仲喺度叫緊，我仲見到佢哋喎，邊度又去咁遠啊？ Don Quixote 當然唔理咧，就話你 check 下你身上面咧有冇嗰啲追蟲啊？因為啲人話過咗赤道位，啲追蟲咧就會冇晒噶啦。咁當然追蟲依然喺度啦。咁你船行都冇咯，就見到啲水青屋。Don Quixote 就一口咬定呢啲係城堡嚟嘅。魔法師咧又再次施法啦，令到蒙蔽咗佢哋嘅眼睛。表面上係水青屋，實際上係城堡嚟嘅。咁入面咧一定係囚禁住一啲騎士啊，忠義之士，佢要釋放佢哋。咁但係咧隻船就失控，就陷入咗水流。正當要捲入去水車嘅時候咧，呢啲水車屋嘅漁民同埋啲水車屋嘅人咧就趕忙拯救咗 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 啦，令到佢哋兩個幸免於難。但係呢隻船咧亦都被捲入咗水車嗰度，咁咧就碎晒。啲漁夫見到隻船爛晒就非常之憤怒啦，因為隻船估計係佢哋噶啦，咁就要求賠償。Don Quixote就話：我可以賠俾你，但係你要放咗你嘅城堡入邊嘅囚犯先。眾人就覺得你講咩啊？你係咪黐線噶？Don Quixote就話：冇辦法啦，呢個魔法實在係太嚴重啦，我只能夠放棄，希望下一個騎士會嚟救你哋啦。於是乎咧就賠咗錢俾呢啲人。呢啲水車人呢，見到阿 Don Quixote 同 Sancho 佢哋講嘅嘢啊、裝扮啊，都係咁無厘頭咧，就只能夠話你哋兩個一定係癲佬嚟噶啦，我哋走啦。於是乎咧就翻咗入去。作者咧亦都話有一句評價嘅對呢件事。侍從兩人咧翻去佢哋嘅畜生嗰度，亦都繼續做佢哋嘅畜生，即係話佢哋猶如野獸一般點樣嘅生活。好，我哋睇下啲字有啲咩字同大家分享。compute， 我以為呢個字咧係電腦發明咗之後先出現嘅，但原來唔係喎，好多世紀之前咧都有呢個字噶啦。compute， C-O-M-P-U-T-E， 動詞嚟嘅 ，reckon or calculate， 計算啦。一個深少少嘅字啦 terraqueous 有少用啊呢個 T-E-R-R-A-Q-U-E-O-U-S 形容詞嚟嘅 consisting or formed of land and water 即係水陸合成嘅有咁嘅意思喺度 terra 就係陸地嘅意思啦 aqua 就係水啦 terraqueous 陸水啦水陸合成 machination M-A-C-H-I-N-A-T-I-O-N 名詞嚟嘅 a plot or scheme 你陰謀詭計個字前端咧就有啲似 machine 呢個字嘅 M-A-C-H-I-N-E 嘅咁大句 machination 好呢一節讀到呢度下一節再同大家讀你聽拜拜 大家好，讀你聽嘅時間，今日繼續讀 Miguel de Cervantes 嘅 Don Quixote， 讀到 Part 2嘅第30節，呢節叫做 Of Don Quixote's Adventure with a Fair Huntress。喺名咧就似乎會出現一個女獵人喎，咁究竟會發生咩事呢？提一提翻上一回，自從兩人再一次因為騎士精神嘅迷惑，就令到佢咧唔以為水車就係囚禁其他志同道合騎士嘅城堡啊，二人咧就硬闖城堡，實際上只係水車啦。即場咧就人氣船毀啦，亦都賠償咗金錢嘅損失。二人呢就好似落水狗，就回歸到佢哋野獸般咁嘅日子啦。咁我哋睇下呢一節嘅內文先。
They reached their beasts in low spirits and bad humour enough, knight and squire, Sancho particularly, for with him what touched the stock of money touched his heart, and when any was taken from him, he felt as if he was robbed of the apples of his eyes. In fine, without exchanging a word, they mounted and quitted the famous river, Don Quixote absorbed in thoughts of his love, Sancho in thinking of his advancement, which just then, it seemed to him, he was very far from securing, for, fool as he was, he saw clearly enough that his master's acts were all or most of them utterly senseless, and he began to cast about for an opportunity of retiring from his service and going home some day, without entering into any explanations or taking any farewell of him. Fortune, however, ordered matters after a fashion very much the opposite of what he contemplated. It so happened that the next day, toward sunset, on coming out of a wood, Don Quixote cast his eyes over a green meadow, and at the far end of it observed some people, and as he drew nearer saw that it was a hawking party. Coming closer, he distinguished among them a lady of graceful mien, on a pure white palfrey or hackney, caparisoned with green trappings and a silver-mounted side saddle. The lady was also in green, and so richly and splendidly dressed that splendour itself seemed personified in her. On her left hand she bore a hawk, a proof to Don Quixote's mind that she must be some great lady and the mistress of the whole hunting party, which was the fact. So he said to Sancho, "Run, Sancho, my son, and say to that lady on the palfrey with the hawk that I, the Knight of the Lions, kiss the hands of her exalted beauty, and if her excellence will grant me leave, I will go and kiss them in person and place myself at her service for aught that may be in my power and her highness may command. And mind, Sancho, how thou speakest, and take care not to thrust in any of thy proverbs into thy message." "You've got a likely one here to thrust any in," said Sancho. "Leave me alone for that. Why, this is not the first time in my life I have carried messages to high and exalted ladies." "Except that thou didst carry to the lady Dulcinea," said Don Quixote. "I know not that thou hast carried any other, at least in my service." "That is true," replied Sancho, "but pledges don't distress a good payer, and in a house where there's plenty supper is soon cooked. I mean there's no need of telling or warning me about anything, for I'm ready for everything and know a little of everything." "That I believe, Sancho," said Don Quixote. "Go and good luck to thee, and Godspeed thee." Sancho went off at top speed, forcing Dapple out of his regular pace, and came to where the fair huntress was standing, and dismounting knelt before her and said, "Fair lady, that knight that you see there, the Knight of the Lions by name, is my master, and I am a squire of his, and at home they call me Sancho Panza, the same Knight of the Lions, who was called not long since the Knight of the Rueful Countenance, sent by me to say, may it please your highness to give him leave that, with your permission, approbation, and consent, he may come and carry out his wishes, which are, as he says, and I believe, to serve your exalted loftiness and beauty. And if you give it, your ladyship will do a thing which will rebound to your honour, and he will receive a most distinguished favour and happiness." "You have indeed, squire," said the lady, "delivered your message with all the formalities such messages require. Rise up, for it is not right that the squire of a knight so great as he of the Rueful Countenance, of whom we have heard a great deal here, should remain on his knees. Rise, my friend, and bid your master welcome to the services of myself and the Duke my husband in the country house we have here." Sancho got up, charmed as much by the beauty of the good lady as by her high-bred air and her courtesy, but above all, by what she had said about having heard of his master, the Knight of the Rueful Countenance. For if she did not call him Knight of the Lions, it was no doubt because he had so lately taken the name. "Tell me, brother squire," asked the Duchess, This master of yours, is he not one of whom there is a history extant in print, called the ingenious gentleman, Don Quixote of La Mancha, who has for the lady of his heart a certain Dulcinea del Toboso? He is the same, Senora, replied Sancho, and that squire of his who figures, or ought to figure, in the said history under the name of Sancho Panza, is myself, unless they have changed me in the cradle, I mean in the press. I am rejoiced at all this, said the Duchess. Go, brother Panza, and tell your master that he is welcome to my estate, and that nothing could happen to me that could give me greater pleasure. Sancho returned to his master mightily pleased with this gratifying answer, and told him all the great lady had said to him, lauding to the skies, in his rustic phrase, her rare beauty, her graceful gaiety, and her courtesy. Don Quixote drew himself up briskly in his saddle, fixed himself in his stirrups, settled his visor, gave Rocinante the spur, and with an easy bearing advanced to kiss the hands of the Duchess, who, having sent to summon the Duke her husband, told him while Don Quixote was approaching all about the message, and as both of them had read the first part of this history, and from it were aware of Don Quixote's crazy turn, they awaited him with the greatest delight and anxiety to make his acquaintance, meaning to fall in with his humour and agree with everything he said, and, so long as he stayed with them, to treat him as a knight-errant, with all the ceremonies usual in the books of chivalry they had read, for they themselves were very fond of them. Don Quixote now came up with his visor raised, and as he seemed about to dismount, Sancho made haste to go and hold his stirrup for him. But in getting down off Dapple, he was so unlucky as to hitch his foot in one of the ropes of the pack saddle in such a way that he was unable to free it, and was left hanging by it with his face and breast on the ground. Don Quixote, who was not used to dismount without having the stirrup held, fancying that Sancho had by this time come to hold it for him, threw himself off with a lurch and brought Rocinante's saddle after him, which was no doubt badly girthed and saddled, and he both came to the ground. Not without discomfiture to him, and abundant curses muttered between his teeth against the unlucky Sancho, who had his foot still in the shackles. The Duke ordered his huntsmen to go to the help of knight and squire, and they raised Don Quixote, sorely shaken by his fall, and he, limping, advanced as best he could to kneel before the noble pair. This, however, the Duke would by no means permit. On the contrary, dismounting from his horse, he went and embraced Don Quixote, saying, I am grieved, Sir Knight of the Rueful Countenance, that your first experience on my ground should have been such an unfortunate one as we have seen, but the carelessness of the squires is often the cause of worse accidents. That which has happened me in meeting you, mighty prince, replied Don Quixote, cannot be unfortunate, even if my fall had not stopped short of the depths of the bottomless pit, for the glory of having seen you would have lifted me up and delivered me from it. My squire, God's curse upon him, is better at unloosing his tongue in talking impertinence than in tightening the girths of a saddle to keep it steady. But however I may be, fallen or raised up, on foot or on horseback, I shall always be at your service and that of my lady the Duchess, your worthy consort, worthy queen of beauty and paramount princess of courtesy. Gently, Signor Don Quixote of La Mancha, said the Duke, where my lady Donna Dulcinea del Toboso is, it is not right that other beauties should be praised. Sancho, by this time released from his entanglement, was standing by, and before his master could answer, he said, There is no denying, and it must be maintained, that my lady Dulcinea del Toboso is very beautiful, but the hair jumps up where one least expects it, and I have heard say that what we call nature is like a potter that makes vessels of clay, and he who makes one fair vessel can as well make 2 or 3 or 100. I say so because, by my faith, my lady the Duchess is in no way behind my mistress the lady Dulcinea del Toboso. Don Quixote turned to the Duchess and said, Your Highness may conceive that never had knight-errant in this world a more talkative or droll esquire that I have, and he will prove the truth of what I say, if your Highness is pleased to accept of my service for a few days. In which the Duchess made answer, That worthy Sancho is droll I consider a very good thing, because it is a sign that he is shrewd. For drollery and sprightliness, Signor Don Quixote, as you very well know, do not take up their abode with dull wits, and as good Sancho is droll and sprightly, I here set him down as shrewd. And talkative, added Don Quixote. So much the better, said the Duke, for many droll things cannot be said in few words, but not to lose time in talking. Come, great knight of the Rueful Countenance. Of the lions, your Highness must say, said Sancho, for there is no rueful countenance nor any such character now. He of the lions be it, continued the Duke. I say, let Sir Knight of the Lions come to the castle of mine close by, where he shall be given that reception which is due to so exalted a personage, and which the Duchess and I are wont to give to all knights-errant who come there. By this time Sancho had fixed and girthed Rocinante's saddle, and Don Quixote having got on his back and the Duke mounted a fine horse, they placed the Duchess in the middle and set out for the castle. The Duchess desired Sancho to come to her side, for she found infinite enjoyment in listening to his shrewd remarks. Sancho required no pressing, but pushed himself in between them and the Duke, who thought it rare good fortune to receive such a knight-errant and such a homely squire in their castle.
好，呢一節好簡短咁樣讀完啦。咁侍從兩人喺叢林嗰度咧，就遇到旅獵者，結果佢係一個貴族有爵位嘅。呢個貴婦咧就對於 Sancho 幾鍾愛嘅，因為覺得佢咧就精力充沛啦，帶俾佢歡笑。另一方面咧，侍從兩人對於貴婦當然係非常之欣賞，覺得佢好靚啦，好想上前去結識佢。呢個伯爵咧就邀請侍從兩人咧就去佢嘅城堡。值得提咧就係呢個伯爵同埋伯爵夫人都有提到已經聽過 Don Quixote 嘅名號啦 ，Rueful Countenance 沉默嘅面孔呢個名號。但係咧 Sancho 就更正咗兩人咧，話俾佢聽佢已經改咗名啦，佢已經叫咗做 Knight of the Lion， 佢梗係獅子騎士啦。好，我哋睇下呢啲字有啲咩字同大家分享。Discomfiture 名詞嚟嘅 ，discomfiture。就咁睇字面咧，有啲似 discomfort 啊，意思係咧 a feeling of unease or embarrassment、awkwardness。呢個似乎係一種社交場合上面嘅不適，有啲尷尬啦。Girth 係動詞嘅話咧，佢意思係 surround、encircle 包圍、圍繞。好，呢節讀到呢度，下一節仲有得我哋聽，拜拜。